No technological breakthrough impacted the course of 22nd century history to the same extent that the Kearney Fushida drive did. It propelled mankind to new frontiers, allowing us to explore distant solar systems and search for habitable planets to settle. First to experience this new freedom was the crew of TAS Pathfinder. After materializing at the Tau Ceti jump point, Norm McKenna took the ship in system, surveying the alien worlds as they passed. On December 15, 2108, research teams descended onto Tau Ceti 4 and found conditions to be better suited for human physiology than their wildest dreams. The crew thus dubbed the planet New Earth, a name it still retains to this day despite the gradual transition towards referring to humanity's homeworld as Terra. Michelle Land etched her name in the history books when she became the first person to set foot on an extrasolar object. Various local samples and wildlife were taken, but so too was one of the survey drones detached from Magellan 1 half a century earlier. Upon their return home, each member of the crew was treated like celebrities. The success of TAS Pathfinder in travelling to another world helped to quell unrest on Earth, but the Terran Alliance seemingly could not resist fanning the flames. In short order, they announced plans to establish a permanent colony on New Earth. Over ardent protests, in May 2109, construction began on a number of new vessels, the first of which, TAS Ark, was due to be completed in 5 years' time. McKenna and his crew, meanwhile, continued their journey through space. Over the next year, TAS Pathfinder travelled to 35 other star systems within a 40 light-year radius of Sol, and found several other marginally habitable worlds, though none that could match New Earth. In February 2110, the venerable ship made its last voyage back to Tau Ceti with 35 souls on board. Together, they established the first research outpost on an alien world. While the Deimos project was looking to other stars, the Alliance World Parliament was not neglecting the Terran system. Over the past century, dozens of minor outposts had sprung up on various planets, moons, and asteroids, but none of these could be considered a true colony, as their population was almost entirely transitory. What's more, if mankind was to settle other star systems, they would need experience altering the environment to better suit human biology. Thus, the Department of Mega Engineering was created, with its first mandate to terraform Mars. Project Lowell was launched in 2110, a multi-generational undertaking that aimed to produce a breathable atmosphere by the 23rd century. First, comets were deorbited using the Phobos skyhook and launched at the world to add water ice and other greenhouse gases, while asteroids were towed into proximity and mined for materials used to construct 2 gigantic orbital mirrors, which would gradually increase surface temperatures. Once the asteroids were hollowed out, they were crashed into the surface, the kinetic energy of hundreds of such collisions further raising the temperature. Dome then seeded the red planet with blue-green algae, which would slowly alter the makeup of the thin Martian air. After a series of delays, each one adding to the price tag, TAS Ark made its maiden voyage on March 8, 2116, carrying almost 500 colonists to Tau Ceti. Every passenger was carefully vetted for skills and health complications before beginning the journey. But what wasn't made public is that 10% of those individuals had been volunteered by the Alliance Special Security Council, effectively becoming slave labor. Control of this colony fell to a Terran Alliance-appointed governor, setting a dangerous precedent for anyone looking to escape the overbearing world government. With an ever-increasing number of people heading into space, both near and far, concerns started to grow about the possibility of an attack on one of these sites. In 2120, the Alliance World Parliament formed the Terran Space Navy, ostensibly as a means to ensure the safety of these far-flung outposts, commissioning 6 new vessels to outfit their fleet over the next decade. In truth, the TSN served as a means for the government to project their power into space, and to ensure they got what they felt was owed. TAS Charger was launched in 2122, becoming the first ship equipped with a Kearney Fushida drive to carry weapons. This came not a moment too soon. By 2123, expanded mining operations within the asteroid belt and further development in KF technology brought the cost of constructing a jump drive down to levels where individual nations or megacorporations could consider financing their own interstellar transports. These early pioneers represented little more than a trickle compared to the flood that would follow later, but it nonetheless began the period we now refer to as the First Exodus. The Nippon Confederation, United States of America, and United States of Europe were the first to build their own colony ships. By getting in on the action ahead of their peers, it gave those countries freedom to pick the most promising sites for themselves. Once the less affluent regions were able to fund their own expeditions, they had to be content with second-class worlds or longer journeys to equivalents further out. This created a feedback loop where the rich got richer and the poor fell further behind. Even centuries later, long after those old nation-states have ceased to exist, human space is still dominated by people descended from those regions. Unfortunately, with so many thousands departing for uncharted stars, it was only a matter of time until misfortune befell one of those expeditions. On April 26, 2128, the Bolivar Foundation vessel Liberator was preparing to make its initial jump. The drive discharged as planned, the vessel vanished from sight, and was never seen or heard from again. Liberator became the first ship to experience what was known as a misjump, a malfunction which can lead to the complete destruction of a craft. This disaster led some eccentrics to speculate that hyperspace was not the empty void they envisioned, but rather one populated with transdimensional beings inhabiting the warp between reality that would snatch any vessel passing through their chaotic domain. In the wake of this tragedy, the Terran Alliance put a stop to what they perceived as a wave of dissidents fleeing to parts unknown. On May 25th, barely a month after the accident, the Colonization Procedure Referendum narrowly passed through Parliament, imposing a slew of new controls and checks on future expansion. Only authorized individuals would be allowed to book passage out of the solar system. All colony ships must be escorted to their destination by an armed vessel of the TSN. Any new colony was to be administered by an appointed governor and fell under the sole authority of the Terran Alliance Foreign Ministry. In short, no matter where you went, no matter what you found, it belonged to the Alliance. Despite the restrictions imposed on them, those individuals with a sense of adventure that only journeying to the stars could quench were not deterred from pursuing their dream. Initially, there was much excitement about the number of planets that lay within the so-called Goldilocks zone of their local sun, but this gradually faded as prospective colonists discovered that the true scarcity lay in how few worlds possessed potable water. Purification systems of the size needed to support permanent habitation were large, heavy, expensive, and required regular maintenance, all things which made them impractical. Yet attempting to do without them had already resulted in the deaths of a handful of fledgling colonies to contaminated water. This limited early expansion to just a few dozen perfect worlds. Nevertheless, construction of KF drive-equipped spacecraft only increased during this period, with Boeing Interstellar launching the Aquila-class transport in 2148 as the first mass-produced vessel of its type. As an aside, beginning in the 2140s, 3 of the slowboat colonies that had left in the latter years of the 21st century began arriving at the viable worlds identified by the Magellan program, only to discover that they had already been colonized. Of the others that had survived the voyage out to less hospitable systems, it would take another 200 years before they re-established contact. and the Magellan 6 stowaways would remain undiscovered for hundreds of years even beyond that. The next step in terraforming Mars began in 2151, with the introduction of more complex life forms to the surface. By 2160, the Red Planet was home to a modest population of 15,000 people, with a few thousand more in orbit aboard the newly constructed Martian orbital habitat. With near unlimited funds to draw upon, the Department of Mega Engineering's Project Lowell was proceeding well, though the inhabitants were still required to wear environmental suits and rebreathers if venturing outside. A vast number of atmospheric processors were installed as the final stage, with the project concluding ahead of schedule in the final decade of the 22nd century. It remains one of the most significant alterations mankind has ever made to a planet's environment, second only to Dome's next undertaking. As the Terran Alliance expanded outwards, it became increasingly difficult to keep tabs on the most distant colonies. Early KF drives were limited to just 15 light-years in range. Recharging was a process that took weeks and consumed most of their fuel. Some of the better established systems had tankers waiting at the jump points, but at more fringe outposts, a ship might have to navigate in-system to refuel before returning back to a safe distance from which they could then proceed onwards. By 2168, transiting from one end of settled space to the other took approximately 3 months. That year, the Alliance World Parliament undertook a grand survey, a process that would take 4 years to complete. The public reason for this census was to update records and satisfy curiosity, but there was an undercurrent of Big Brother keeping an eye on things. Most colonists saw it for what it was, a show of force. They published their findings in August 2172. Mankind had now spread to 108 worlds within a 60 light-year radius of Terra. With centuries of hindsight, we can see now that this figure was a significant underestimate. Humanity had already reached planets more than twice that distance from its homeworld. The nature of that word was also changing, as the first generations born in the earliest colonies grew up with no strong attachment to their species' planet of origin. 2177 saw the formation of the Lyran Cartel. The company's founder had just made a technological breakthrough that would allow a fleet of 16 ships to jump in tandem between systems. Like a complex three-dimensional Venn diagram, an area of space suspended between them would also be carried through hyperspace to their destination. Others had dismissed this possibility as having no practical purpose, as whatever object was in that zone would be torn apart by competing gravitational pulls from the individual vessels. As such, Ryan was able to patent his technique, a decision that would soon make him one of the wealthiest individuals of the era. He saw the potential for taking water-ice comets from systems with no habitable worlds and moving them in large chunks 2 kilometers across to planets that could benefit from clean, pure water. Shuttles would then transport the water ice down to the surface, whereupon airships would distribute it from the spaceports to the outlying towns. The Lyran Cartel allowed for a range of planets that had previously been written off to become viable destinations, opening the floodgates to new colonization efforts. Ryan was doing far more than just providing water though. He was actually operating an underground railroad for people looking to flee the oppressive regime back on Earth. It wasn't uncommon for one of his ships to go missing, written off in the books as a misjump, but actually carrying hundreds of people out into distant space. All this alarmed the Terran Alliance considerably. The cost of reaching and sustaining an off-world settlement was coming down, while the challenge of monitoring just the existing colonies was already pushing the Terran Space Navy to the limit. Their authority could become seriously undermined if some of Earth's non-member countries banded together into a new power block and began launching their own colony ships. However remote the possibility that a rival Star Empire might emerge was, Geneva decided to take action to nip such an eventuality in the bud. Whenever a country decided to secede from the alliance, they were invariably branded as separatists by those who remained, a term which soon expanded to encompass anyone who was not part of the organization. Rhetoric turned different to dangerous, and the Terran Alliance armed forces deployed to bring all of Earth under one banner for good. Fighting broke out all across the Third World as they struggled to maintain their independence. In 2179, the Hong Kong Free State, one of the few islands of stability outside of the Alliance, was overrun by the Chinese Republic. Pacifying the final holdouts took years, but there was never any doubt as to who would come out on top. Their victory proved to be a poison pill for the Terran Alliance. All those dissidents they had driven out were now living within their borders. Waves of violence swept over previously peaceful regions as conquered people expressed their discontent. Perhaps the most infamous group to come out of this period was known as the New World Disciples. This small band of radicals went straight for the jugular. In 2182, they began a 6-year campaign of terror that resulted in the deaths of 26 heads of state, 14 Alliance Parliament representatives, and 135 other individuals. Tragically, Rudolf Ryan became one of their victims in 2185. The threat was only eliminated after their headquarters was traced to Nepal, after which the TAAF launched a mass assault to eradicate them for good. The attacks, which specifically targeted politicians and civil servants working at Geneva, gave the impetus and justification for a greater expansion in the Alliance World Government's transnational power. In the name of putting an end to the systemic terror attacks that plagued them, their agents were permitted to freely cross borders to pursue the extremists wherever they bolted. When caught, they would impose their own laws, bypassing whatever regional authority might have existed. But as an organization that was originally envisioned as simply a trade partnership, the Terran Alliance lacked a constitution that might protect the individual rights and liberties of the accused. Harsh justice was meted out, with many of those arrested disappearing altogether. The transformation of what had once been an idealistic, science-driven union of cooperation into an authoritarian police state was nearly complete. Thank you very much for watching, guys. This was the third chapter in the Terran Alliance mini-series. We have passed the halfway point now. We've reached pretty much the end of the 22nd century. Quite a lot has happened in the 80 years or so that this covered. Humanity has settled dozens of worlds now, all relatively close to Terra though. The inner sphere as we know it in 3025 doesn't yet exist, and won't do for some time. I didn't mention it in the video because I wanted to keep this focused purely on Terran Alliance history, but the leader of that New World Disciples group I mentioned was actually one of the earliest known instances of a future great house playing a part in history, that being, I think it was Elias Liao. Next time we're going to pick things up in the final decade of the 22nd century, and we're going to discuss the emergence of political parties within the Terran Alliance, and how that resulted in the Outer Reaches Rebellion. So just 2 more chapters to go now. I think the 4th episode will be out next Saturday. It may already be up on my Patreon. I'll let you have a look over there if you want. There's a link in the description. If you did enjoy the video, be sure to give it a like, and you can leave a comment below. I'm trying to respond to as many different people as I can down there. If you've got any questions, feel free to ask them. If you know of anyone else who has an interest in this very early history of the BattleTech universe, be sure to share the video with them as well. Thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you next time for the 4th chapter, Ultra Infinitum.